Hey, today I want to go somewhere that a lot of leadership content and conversations don't really go to. And I want to go there directly because I think it's one of the most consistently misdiagnosed problems in pastoral leadership. Here it is. Your church will never be more intentional than you are. Now, this is true no matter what you're leading. You can lead a business, company, organization, nonprofit, doesn't matter. We're going to talk about it in the context of church. But your church will never be more intentional than you are. Now, I know that statement lands differently depending on where you are. If you're in a season of good momentum, it probably feels kind of encouraging, maybe. If you're in a season of drifting, though, it probably lands a little heavier. Either way, though, it's true. And understanding why it's true structurally changes where you look for solutions. So let's just jump right into this. Here's the pattern that I see just consistently. A pastor feels kind of the pressure of maybe some sort of organizational drift. The calendar, feels reactive. Sunday is coming faster every week, at least it feels like it. Your staff is spending more time solving problems than building solutions and systems. The congregation is showing up, but you can sense they're not really growing, they're not really moving. So the pastor does what all capable leaders do. They study the situation, they audit programming, they bring in a framework, they restructure a ministry lane, maybe hire someone new to the team. And it really does help, but it just helps kind of for a while. Then the drift, it comes back. And the reason that happens more often than not is because the pastor never examined the most obvious variable themselves. Now, I do want to be clear, right? That is not a character failure. It's not about discipline or spirituality in some vague sense. It's a structural blind spot that almost every leader has. All of us have this. It's easier to study a system than to examine a habit. Let me say that again. I think this is really important for us to acknowledge and at least to own, at least for 10 minutes, okay? It's so much easier to study a system than to examine a habit in ourselves. It's easier to fix what's external than what is personal. So here's this kind of structural reality. What your congregation experiences on Sunday is shaped by what you practice the other 6 days. I mean, think about it. Your planning rhythms, your protected time or lack of it, how you engage spiritually when no one is watching. Those are not peripheral to your leadership culture. They are your leadership culture before it becomes your church's culture. So let me just describe a week I've watched play out hundreds of times. You have a good Sunday, a great Sunday maybe, but Sundays are heavy. And so here comes Monday, and Monday is usually for some version of recovery, which is legitimate, right? Sunday is a full output day. But the recovery bleeds into maybe a little Tuesday, and then Tuesday is catch up. Wednesday starts with good intentions, but fills up fast. By Thursday, you're building Sunday again, and then the whole week has been just a reaction to the previous Sunday. Now, multiply that by 52. What does a year of that produce in you, in your staff, in your volunteers, in your church, right? And you know this, your staff mirrors the pace that you set. I got reminded of that a lot when I was a lead pastor. Like your volunteers reflect the clarity or the confusion they receive from your leadership. And your congregation absorbs the culture that your week is creating. So a pastor tells me that they can't figure out, why their church can't get any traction. The answer usually, or at least partially, is closer, much closer than they expect. It's almost always in the week behind the Sunday that no one is examining. So here's the piece I want you to kind of carry, if you can, into this week. Intentionality, it is not a system. It's a personal leadership discipline. Okay, intentionality is not a system. It's a personal leadership discipline that systems can be built, though, to reinforce. So think about that, okay? Intentionality isn't a system, but it's a personal discipline. But we can create some systems around it to reinforce the discipline. Like you can build an excellent assimilation process. You can have a clear discipleship pathway, a solid series calendar, a well-designed volunteer structure. You can have all that, and you can still drift a little bit because systems don't sustain themselves alone, right? It's the leader's discipline behind the systems that does. And when that discipline erodes, the systems always follow, okay? And it's quiet and it's gradual until your culture has kind of softened up enough that no one can quite explain what has happened or even when it happened. But the reality is that it has happened. If you are kind of not protecting time to think, to plan, to pray, to lead from kind of a full place of presence, the systems you build will drift at the pace that you drift. And that's, listen, this isn't a motivation problem. It's just a structural problem in the one place leaders are least likely to look. So so here's what I would offer you just as a practical response to this conversation. And I'm not going to give you a framework, not a new system. We just talked about why. I just want to give you 4 questions that kind of function as a structural audit before you start rethinking your leadership rhythms. So before the next staff restructure, staff meeting, before the next programming evaluation, before any new system is built or evaluated, okay? Just 4 questions I'd love for you to ponder, process first. Okay, first one. Where in my week am I reactive by default? And I don't mean occasionally reactive, okay? That's going to happen. But where am I habitually reacting? Where does my schedule guarantee that I am kind of responding to things rather than leading towards things? Okay, number 2, question 2. Do I have a protected planning rhythm or am I planning in the margins? Okay, there is a difference between time that you've carved out for strategic thinking and the 15 minutes between meetings where you try to, think big for a second. One produces clarity, the other, it just produces anxiety, takes you nowhere. The number one, and just quick pause on this. I coach pastors, consult with churches all over the world, really, and do a lot of work, obviously, here in the U.S. and in the States. And I have pastors reach out to me all the time. And when we talk about working together, the number one thing that keeps them from being able to say yes is they say they don't feel like they have enough time. It's not a money issue. The money thing can be solved pretty easily. It's a time thing. They don't have enough time. To which I kindly, I hope compassionately, empathetically, always respond by saying, you may not have enough time not to do this. Right? If you don't feel like you have enough time to pause and think and work on the church, if you're so busy working in the church, something is going to fail. Something's going to drop. And it may not be quickly, but it's going to drift. And at some point, you will look back and you will wish you would have prioritized time in your calendar for thinking and not just relegated it to the margins. Okay, question 3. Okay, let's get back on here. Question 3. What spiritual disciplines have I quietly let slip away? Like, I'm not asking this to create guilt or shame in any way, not at all. But I am asking because this is the place where at least I believe this is true. I think this is the place where pastoral drift usually starts. It usually doesn't start with strategy and, it's private rhythms, right? That's where this really begins. And when those go, the leader gets a little louder and sometimes a little shallower. And then the 4th one, last question. Where has boundary erosion become normal? Boundary erosion, you know what that is? It's where you have a boundary, but you have slowly allowed that boundary to erode, right? Think about this as like the places you started saying yes to things that were used to say no to them, but now you're saying yes to them and they are crowding out some of the other things that only you can do that you should be doing. Like when everything else or everybody else gets access to you, the leader has nothing left to give as a leader. So those 4 questions, right? They're not self-care questions, right? Those are kind of structural diagnostic questions. And your answers will tell you something about your church's current ceiling. So let me just close with this because I don't want you to hear this conversation as like a soft, this isn't a personal development talk, okay? That is not what this is. Kind of an unintentional pastor, and I don't even want to call you that or call me that or any of us that because that just sounds harsh, but you know what I mean. That it's easy. We all have a little bit of that in us. So an unintentional pastor will eventually produce an unintentional church. And again, this doesn't happen dramatically. It's gradual. But gradually, that's harder to catch, isn't it? Because there is always an explanation, a hard season, a personal transition, a community shift. But that drift, it does accumulate. By the time a congregation feels stuck, the leader's habits have probably been forming that culture for a long, long time. So you can't kind of install intentionality into a church if your own habits are quietly undermining that direction. So the most powerful move that you may make right now for your church is not a staff conversation or a programming, improvement. It might be blocking a couple of hours to run an honest audit of your own rhythms. The change that your church needs may be waiting on the change that you have been postponing. That's the word. And that's today's conversation.